Hi everybody, and welcome to session 3 of IBS Relief Now. I hope you're continuing to make good use of the different materials related to session 1, where we talked about IBS as a syndrome and the different factors that can trigger it, and then in session 2, where we talked about the different brains and brain systems that we have inside of us and how critically important it is to be able to coordinate and regulate their activity to bring about a kind of internal harmony that helps to quiet and calm down the symptoms of IBS. Well, today in session 3 we're going to be moving into the topic of food and eating, the food choices that we make, and the behaviors and routines around eating that we engage in, both of which can make a very big difference in the particular form of IBS that you show, and most importantly, can make a critical difference in helping you bring your IBS pattern under control so you can have the relief that you're seeking now. Doesn't it seem pretty reasonable to think that eating should be a simple process? You pick something that's edible, you put it in your mouth, you chew it up, and you swallow it. But actually, nothing could be further from the truth. Do you know that there are certain creatures that live on the face of the planet that don't have to do that? Things like the plankton that live in the ocean, they don't have to. They absorb their energy directly from the sun through the process that we call photosynthesis. Every green leaf and plant on the face of the earth essentially does much the same thing. If we had the ability to engage in photosynthesis, we wouldn't have anywhere near the difficulty that we do in getting the energy that we need to survive. But since we don't do photosynthesis, we rely on eating things that do. Plants, fruits, vegetables, and certain animals. We eat them in order to borrow the energy that they have absorbed, to break it down through our digestive process to give us the energy that we need to survive. The process of digestion is actually a complex one, and there are many players involved, each of which has a different role. You see, the things that make their way into our digestive tract, that 20-foot long tube, 25-foot long tube, is really where food passes through us, but it doesn't necessarily get into us. And we'll be talking a little bit about what has to happen in order for what we put into our mouth to actually become part of who we are. If it doesn't get in, it's just passing through. And of course, with IBS, that whole process of how and when things pass through is part of the problem in the first place. So let's talk about some of the players involved in eating and digesting. Let's start with what happens in the mouth. Our mouth is lined with teeth that are covered in enamel, the hardest substance we have in our whole body. And thank goodness, because we rely on those choppers to break down the food at the first stage, mixing it with this high acid saliva to begin the work of chemically breaking down food so we can get access to the chemical bonds that have to be broken in order for the energy contained in the food to be released. Once we have broken it down enough and are ready to swallow, it begins that 2-foot long journey from our mouth into our stomach, passing along the esophagus. Now, as it's moving its way south from the mouth through the esophagus and into the stomach, it's being further mixed with saliva so that by the time it arrives in the stomach, it's ready to be immersed in that very corrosive, high acid bath that really breaks the food down enough so that when it moves into the small intestine, it's more or less ready to be absorbed across the lining of the small intestine and into the body. So as I've mentioned, the job of the small intestine is to make a go, no-go decision. What I mean by that is that the lining of the small intestine is absolutely filled with immune system cells. And the immune system's main job is to distinguish between what is safe and not safe, what is part of the body, what is not part of the body, and if it isn't, is it safe enough to be allowed in where it can be absorbed into the body. So that decision is a critical one for our long-term and our short-term health. We know, for example, if we eat bad food, we can end up with a case of food poisoning. We know the symptoms that follow from that. That is in part a reaction by the immune system to this nasty bacteria that has gotten in with some spoiled food. It's working very hard to guard that border. The small intestine is working very hard to guard the border between what's just passing through and what has the right to get absorbed across the lining into the blood, where it can be transported to the various parts of the rest of the body that need it. In order for the small intestine to do its job, it has to operate in a very watery environment. So part of what's going on as food is passing through the small intestine is water is being pulled from other cells in the body into the small intestine so that the chemical reactions that take place there can work best because they work best in a watery environment. Well, that creates a challenge as we move to the next of the players involved in digestion. Next, we get down to the large intestine, which in many ways has the opposite role. Its main job is to reabsorb water into the body. In order not to dehydrate, it has to pull that water back in. But with IBS, if we don't pull in enough water, or if things move through the large intestine too quickly, what do we have? We have diarrhea. And we know from people who can have 5, 10, or even 15 bouts of diarrhea in a day, there's tremendous loss of water. The large intestine has not been able to do its job of reabsorbing water. We end up becoming dehydrated, which is a problem for people with diarrhea-dominant IBS. It can also go the other way, where it's taking too long for the food to go through. More water is reabsorbed, leaving what is behind dry and hard and difficult to pass. That's a symptom pattern we call constipation, and is seen in people with constipation-dominant IBS. And of course, there are people who end up going back and forth between both ends of that continuum, sometimes having too much diarrhea and sometimes having too much in the form of constipation. And the final stage happens as that food moves down into the part of the large intestine that we call the colon and the rectum. And for people with IBS, that too can be an area that can be problematic. We have round muscles called sphincters that are partly under voluntary control and partly under involuntary control. And I've talked with and worked with many people who can't seem to control that muscle effectively, and they'll have bowel accidents or live with tremendous anxiety about the possibility of not being able to control when they release that stool through a bowel movement out of the body. So really, this 25-foot-long journey has different stages, different players, and different roles. In the end, what we're trying to do as we digest is extract the energy, make it available to the body, supply the raw materials that the body needs to grow new tissues, to repair tissues. And as you can see from that complexity, there are many different places along that journey where things can go haywire in ways that we call different patterns of IBS. Now, before we leave this topic, I want to go back into the large intestine for a moment. Most of the bacteria that we have in our body live in the large intestine. It's estimated that our physical body is made up of about 30 trillion cells. Inside our large intestine, estimates are that we may have as many as 100 trillion cells. Some estimates are even higher, saying that we have 10 times the number of bacteria in and on our bodies as compared to the physical cells that we have that make up you and me. The point is, there is a lot of them. And before you get too grossed out at the idea of having such a colony of microbiotic citizens inside of you, take time to recognize that you and I would not survive if it were not for the presence of these bacteria. They are essential for synthesizing or producing certain vitamins that we need to survive, and they're also responsible for synthesizing more of the hormones that regulate our body's functioning than the number that are even produced by our brain itself. We need this mutually dependent symbiotic relationship between us and the bacteria that live inside of us in order for us to survive and to thrive. The more that we're learning about the role of the bacteria in our day-to-day health, the more amazed I become. We find that the bacteria are involved in this incredibly complex two-way relationship where the choices we make, the attitudes that we have, the sleep that we have, influences the kind of growth that certain bacteria in our gut have, and it suppresses the growth of other kind of bacteria. In the other direction, we're finding that the bacteria themselves secrete different chemicals and molecules that are so essential to many aspects of our mental, emotional, and physical well-being. So we really are part of a complex ecosystem or a complex microbiome that regulates so many different aspects of our health, and that's why we're going to be talking in more detail about the role of the microbiome, what you can do to influence it in the direction of reduced IBS symptomatology and improved overall health and functioning. At the beginning of this session, I said that we're talking not only about food, but also about eating and the behaviors and rituals around how and when we eat. One of my teachers said we have to recognize that from early in life, our mouth in particular, the oral cavity, is our emotional learning center. There is fascinating research that looks at what it is that helps establish a sense of security and emotional safety inside of us, and how critical our mouth is to the establishment of that emotional safety. In many respects, our self-identity begins with the intersection between our mouth and the world around us. Within hours of being born, we may be nursing, and right away there's a question of whether that parent, whether that caregiver is responsive to us, is consistently available to us, helps us when we're not feeling well, and comforts us so that we can feel better. So the mouth really has a critical role from the first hours of our life in establishing our attitude and our outlook that carries forward over the rest of our life. We know that when it comes to IBS, different aspects of that early emotional learning play out in big and small ways. Having worked with people for more than 30 years with IBS, I can tell you that at least half and probably as many as 3/4 of the people that I see, when we get into the details of their particular pattern of IBS, we find a host of issues of a more emotional nature having to do with how and when they feel safe, secure, connected, visible, validated, acknowledged in their day-to-day lives. When those different things of a social connection nature aren't happening well, it can become a major trigger and major activator of IBS symptoms. We see that, for example, in patterns of eating disorders, anorexia or bulimia. We also see it in a more common pattern of compulsive overeating. We see it in the explosion of obesity problems across the country that put us at tremendous increased risk for diabetes and the cascade of physical health challenges that go along with that. The point that I'm making, and that again we're going to come to in more detail later in the course, is that when it comes to food choices and eating behaviors, it's not just about physical nutrition. Eating is intimately connected to how we seek emotional comfort, emotional connection, and emotional safety. So many of the people that I see end up using foods for reasons that have very little to do with their physical nutritional needs and a heck of a lot more to do with their emotional needs that are being inappropriately addressed through unhealthy eating habits that keep IBS symptom patterns alive. I'm sure that I'm not the first one to mention that our digestive system evolved over an incredibly long period of time, and it was used to digesting whole foods. It wasn't used to eating refined sugars and processed foods and the kind of things that are so abundant in our diets today. If you want to make one shift in the direction of healthier eating and IBS symptom control, it's to make that move in the direction of consuming whole foods. I'm talking about lean meats, leafy vegetables, and lots of them, a good amount, a moderate amount of fruits, and certain kinds of carbohydrates. The body needs to consume the proteins in order to have access to the materials that we need to repair and grow the physical body. We need fats in order to provide energy reserves for later use, but we also use fats as insulation in many parts of the body. Your brain itself is made up of a lot of certain types of fats that allow the signals along the nerves to be communicated clearly, accurately, and quickly. So we need fats not only as an energy reserve and as insulation, but we also need it to actually facilitate healthy communication in and around the body. The carbohydrates are the food source we turn to in order to get rapid access to energy. Carbohydrates are generally most easily converted into raw energy for the body to use, whereas the fats and the proteins take a lot longer to break down into that ultimate fundamental energy source. So when it comes to managing IBS, it's really important to pay attention to the world of carbohydrates. Think of carbohydrates as that group of foods that the body turns to first when it's seeking a source of energy. Carbs are broken down into energy much more readily than fats or proteins, but within the world of carbs there are so-called good carbs and bad carbs. In general, we want to eat carbs that have a low glycemic value. What that means is that the sugariness in the food is not so high that the body gets access to that sugar quickly. It has to work really hard to get there. And the benefit of that is that it keeps your blood sugar relatively even over the course of many hours. On the other hand, if you're eating foods that have a high glycemic value, high sugary value, it means that your body is going to experience tremendous sugar rushes as blood sugar peaks, and then followed by crashes. And that high to low peaking and valleying of our sugar shows up in all sorts of difficulties in addition to activation of IBS symptom patterns. You can see changes in mental fatigue. You can see general changes in overall physical fatigue. You can see increases in moodiness and irritability, impatience, and you can also see a negative impact on many of the organ systems in the body as a whole. So we want to be careful about making choices in favor of low glycemic foods, beginning to reduce the amount of high glycemic foods that we consume in our diet. Over the last number of years, there has been an important development in the management of IBS, and that has to do with reduction in the amount of foods containing what are called FODMAPs. FODMAP is an acronym for short chain or short length carbohydrates that are irritating to the intestinal tract and that are powerful activators of IBS symptoms. You can find a list of foods that are low FODMAP foods. On this video, I'll put up a list of those kind of foods so that you can look it over. And you want to begin to move your diet in the direction of experimenting with reducing high FODMAP foods, replacing them with low FODMAP foods, and notice what impact that has on your day-to-day experience of IBS symptoms. In general, when people reduce the amount of high FODMAP foods in their diet, one of the things that they notice is a decrease in bloating and the pain that comes with bloating and bowel distension. There can be a decrease in gassiness, but the point is reducing the amount of high FODMAP foods that you eat in your diet is a really effective way for some people of being able to reduce the frequency and intensity of some of the most uncomfortable and embarrassing symptoms of IBS. So we've talked a little bit today about the nature of changes in our diet. You might be interested to learn that the origin of the word diet is diata, D-I-A-T-A, which in its original language didn't mean the foods we ate. It meant the overall lifestyle that we maintain that includes the foods we eat and how we eat them. And I think that's a really important lesson for us as we go forward. IBS relief now is not just a checklist of do's and don'ts, of foods you should eat and foods you should avoid. The message here is because it's a syndrome, we need to take a look at making necessary lifestyle changes. We have to change the dieta, not just our diet. So here are some examples of some things that I would strongly recommend you begin to bring into your daily routine, into your weekly lifestyle, because of the powerful beneficial impact that they can have on IBS symptomatology. The first suggestion for this coming week is to pay attention to how you use your teeth. Specifically, I'm encouraging you to really pay attention to how you chew your food. I'm amazed, even in my own case, at how often I might bite on something 2-3 times and then I feel this impulse to swallow it right down. It's hard to slow down enough to chew your food thoroughly, but doing so gives your digestive system a real boost because it doesn't have to work as hard to break the food down further because you've done so much of the preliminary work in the mouth itself. Moreover, when you're chewing thoroughly you're typically eating more slowly, and that can make a big difference in reducing IBS symptoms as well. The second dhyana suggestion, the second lifestyle suggestion, is that when you're eating, don't just look at it as an opportunity to stuff as many calories in your mouth in the shortest time possible. When you're eating, make the focus on two things. On the food you're eating, its taste, its texture, its smell or scent, aroma. And if you happen to be with someone, make sure that the focus of that eating ritual is on the connection between you and the person or persons that you're eating. There's some interesting research, for example, on the kind of mental health benefits that come from having a routine family dinner time each evening, or at least several evenings per week, rather than people just raiding the kitchen, getting some food, stuffing it in their mouth, and going off to the next activity with no real time to slow down and connect. So make your eating time a time to really enjoy the food, and when appropriate, to really enjoy your company. The third suggestion I want to make is to protract or extend the time of your eating. Aim for eating taking at least 20 minutes or 30 minutes. And during that 20 to 30 minutes, focus on chewing thoroughly, put your fork down in between bites, have a conversation, let your mind wander, don't just sit and stuff bite after bite after bite. You might be surprised to notice while you're chewing, before you swallow, you may have a fork or spoon sitting just outside your lips, ready to put in another mouthful as soon as you swallow the one that's in your mouth. That again is a sign of this rush, this intense pace that we maintain in our day-to-day lives. And as we said in session 2, when we slow down, we're activating the parasympathetic system in favor of the sympathetic system, and we're resetting the whole body to a more calm and comfortable state of operating, which can have benefits for you for the activities that you do after you finish your meal. So extend the time, slow it down, keep it at least 20 to 30 minutes, if not longer. The next suggestion has to do with when you finish your last meal in the evening. When you're sleeping, your digestive system is not working as efficiently. So anything that is still in the stomach when you go to sleep has a really difficult time being effectively digested while you're sleeping. So not only is the quality of your sleep likely to be disrupted, but you're throwing off your digestive system. Ideally, you want to have at least 2 hours, and preferably 3, go by from when you finish your last bite and before you actually get into bed to go to sleep. See if in the coming days and weeks you can begin to increase the amount of time, not by going to bed later and later, but where possible, eating your final meal of the day earlier. And if it turns out that you just don't have that much time, concentrate on reducing the amount that you eat for that last meal of the day. The goal being not going to bed with undigested food still sitting in the stomach. You want things to have moved through as much as possible to enhance and enrich your sleep, to really give you restorative sleep, which has spillover benefits into how you wake up and carry on your activities tomorrow. And the last suggestion that I want to offer is another kind of social bonding activity. If you're able to do this, think about taking a leisurely 10, 15, or 20-minute walk after dinner. It's really effective at supporting healthy digestion, but it's also a grand time to practice some good social bonding with whoever you're taking that walk with. Another factor really important in managing IBS is portion control. You want to be able to make sure that the portions you eat give you a chance to feel satiated as opposed to full. We're used to associating having eaten enough with when our stomach is distended. It's actually a feeling of fullness as the stomach walls are being stretched. On the other hand, if you eat more slowly, allowing the body to begin to digest what you're eating, there are actually sensors in the blood vessels of your body and in other parts of the body that are monitoring blood sugar. After about 20 minutes, if you've been eating slowly and in a nice calm way, those sensors will begin to detect an increase in blood sugar and set off a signal that you are done. So you can begin to actually get the cue, start to become tuned into the cue that you've had enough without relying on that sense of fullness, which is usually only a sensation that we feel after we've eaten way more than we need. So the idea of managing portion control is a good way of cooperating peacefully with the systems that our bodies and brains already have to register when we've had enough to keep us healthy and well functioning. Now, before we finish up with session 3 and turn to the practice connected to session 3, let me say just a little bit about the world of prebiotics and probiotics. Prebiotics are foods that are not digestible by our body. Prebiotics feed the bacteria in our gut, and they tend to help produce an increase in the kind of bacteria that really support healthy digestion. So take a look at how you can increase the amount of prebiotic foods or prebiotic supplements that you consume, as well as probiotics. Probiotics are foods like yogurts, for example, or there are supplements that can have good quality bacteria in them. What you are doing when you're eating probiotics, consuming healthy probiotics, is you are reintroducing healthy bacteria, the kind of bacteria that we want lots of in our digestive tract. That's especially important if, for example, you've just had a course of antibiotics. You want to repopulate the gut. But even for the rest of us who haven't recently had to have a dose of antibiotics, regular introduction of probiotic-containing supplements is a good way of helping to maintain a healthy microbiome, which, as we said earlier today, really is sort of the fuel that keeps the rest of the digestive and metabolic engine running smoothly. So at this point, I'd like to have you turn to this session's guided practice. You can either turn to that now or come back to it at another time when you're able to devote 15 or 20 minutes to that guided practice. But regardless, thank you for listening to session 3, and I look forward to talking with you again soon as we move into addressing yet another aspect of how you can obtain IBS relief now.